When Caligula became emperor of Rome in 37 AD, the entire empire celebrated. People lit bonfires in the streets. Sailors threw themselves into the sea in joy. Thousands of animals were sacrificed at temples across the Roman world in gratitude to the gods for finally giving Rome the emperor it deserved. He was 24 years old, charming, handsome, the son of the most beloved general Rome had produced in a generation. Romans looked at him and saw everything they had hoped for and nothing they feared. Within 12 months, every person who had celebrated his rise was either dead or terrified. This is not simply the story of a mad emperor doing insane things. This is the story of what absolute power does to a human soul that was already broken before it ever touched the throne. Before we talk about what Caligula became, we need to understand what he survived to get there. His father Germanicus was the most beloved general in Rome, a man of extraordinary talent and personal warmth who was widely expected to eventually succeed the Emperor Tiberius. His mother Agrippina was fierce, brilliant, and completely devoted to her family. Caligula grew up in military camps on the Rhine frontier, watching his father command the greatest army in the world. Then everything collapsed. Germanicus died in Syria in 19 AD under circumstances suspicious enough that Agrippina publicly accused Tiberius's representatives of poisoning him. Whether true or not, the accusation made her powerful enemies. Caligula was 7 years old when his father died. What followed was one of the most traumatic childhoods any Roman of his generation endured. Tiberius systematically destroyed the family of Germanicus over the following years. Agrippina was arrested on treason charges and eventually starved to death in prison. Two of Caligula's brothers were arrested and died in custody under circumstances that left no doubt about what the emperor wanted. Caligula survived by doing something that required extraordinary self-control from a young man who had every reason for rage and grief. He made himself completely invisible. He expressed no political ambitions. He made no references to his father's enormous popularity. He lived at Tiberius's isolated court on the island of Capri and was outwardly compliant, pleasant, and completely unthreatening. Ancient sources record that even people who pitted him said Rome had never produced a better slave or a worse master. The self-concealment required to survive those years left permanent marks. Tiberius died in 37 AD, and Caligula became emperor to one of the most extraordinary public celebrations in Roman history. The response was genuine mass joy from a population exhausted by the paranoid, murderous final years of Tiberius's reign. Caligula's first months delivered exactly what Romans hoped for. He released political prisoners. He recalled exiles. He burned the files containing the accusations used in Tiberius's treason trials, publicly and theatrically destroying the instruments of the previous reign's fear. He honored his dead family with enormous public ceremonies. He gave money to the Praetorian Guard, to the Roman people, to the army. He staged spectacular games. He was personally accessible and warm in ways Tiberius never was. For 7 months, the reign of Caligula was everything Rome had dreamed it would be. And then in October of 37 AD, he became seriously ill. The illness nearly killed him. He was unconscious or delirious for weeks. The entire empire responded with what ancient sources describe as genuine mass panic. Crowds gathered outside the palace, offering their own lives to the gods in exchange for his recovery. The level of public devotion was extraordinary and overwhelming. He recovered. But the man who emerged from that illness was, according to every ancient source writing about this period, not quite the same man who had entered it. Whether the illness caused neurological damage, whether it broke something in his psychology that had been held together through years of survival, whether nearly dying while being worshipped like a god changed his relationship with reality, something shifted in those weeks and never shifted back. The first signs were subtle. He had Macro, the Praetorian commander who had helped him become emperor, arrested and forced to suicide. Macro had expected reward and received death. He had his cousin Gemellus killed on accusations of praying for Caligula's death during the illness, an accusation so paranoid that ancient sources note Gemellus had been taking medicine for a chronic cough and the smell of the medicine was interpreted as evidence he was taking antidotes against poison. The logic was circular and terrifying. The cough medicine proved he was preparing to survive being poisoned, which proved he was planning to poison the emperor. This was the reasoning of a mind that had moved beyond normal cause and effect into a private reality where suspicion required no evidence and accusation was identical to guilt. He began referring to himself in divine terms, not with the careful ambiguity that Augustus had used when positioning himself as a figure of special religious significance while maintaining the forms of republican modesty. Caligula claimed actual divinity directly and literally. He reportedly appeared in public dressed as various gods, Jupiter, Neptune, Hercules, and expected to be addressed accordingly. He had the heads removed from statues of gods in Rome and replaced with his own portrait. He reportedly set up a temple to his own godhead with a life-sized golden statue of himself that was dressed each day in clothing identical to what he himself was wearing. Ancient sources describe senators and other powerful Romans performing these divine honors with expressions carefully arranged to show neither too much enthusiasm nor too little. The wrong expression in either direction could be fatal. His treatment of the Senate during this period revealed a contempt that went beyond political calculation into something that looked more like deliberate psychological cruelty. He forced senators to run alongside his litter for miles in their formal togas. He made them stand at banquets while he reclined. He reportedly laughed at senators for no reason during formal proceedings, reducing them to anxious uncertainty about what they had done wrong and what the laughter meant for their futures. He appointed his horse Incitatus to the priesthood and reportedly discussed making him consul. Ancient sources debate whether this was genuine madness or a calculated insult designed to show senators that he considered them no more qualified for their positions than an animal. Either interpretation is deeply disturbing in its own way. The violence that characterized Caligula's reign was not random or purely impulsive. It had patterns that reveal something important about his psychology. He killed people who represented threats to his power, real or imagined, with the systematic thoroughness of a man who had watched his own family destroyed by an emperor who had not been thorough enough. He killed people who were too popular, whose public reputations made them potential focal points for opposition. He killed people who were too wealthy, whose fortunes he needed and whose deaths provided the financial resources his increasingly extravagant spending required. He killed people who had shown him insufficient reverence. He killed people for reasons that ancient sources record, and that seemed to have made sense only within whatever internal logic was governing his behavior by this point. The financial dimension of his reign is important and often overlooked in favor of the more dramatic stories. Augustus had left an enormous treasury. Tiberius, who was famously frugal, had added to it substantially. Caligula inherited what ancient sources describe as enormous reserves of cash accumulated across 2 previous reigns. He spent it all in less than a year. The games, the banquets, the building projects, the gifts to the army and the people. The spending was so extraordinary and so rapid that within 12 months the treasury was effectively empty and Caligula needed new revenue sources urgently. His solution was to find reasons to execute wealthy Romans and confiscate their estates. The pattern became self-reinforcing. He needed money. He found enemies. He killed enemies. He took their money. He spent the money. He needed more money. He reinstated the treason trials that he had so theatrically abolished at the beginning of his reign, the same trials whose files he had burned in a public ceremony designed to demonstrate that the era of Tiberian paranoia was over. Now those same mechanisms were running again, producing the same terror, the same accusations, the same cycle of denunciation and death that had defined the reign he had promised to end. Romans who had celebrated the burning of those files watched new files being created with their names potentially in them, and understood that the celebration had been theater. The emperor who had given them hope had become something that made Tiberius's reign look almost manageable in comparison. Because Tiberius at least had been predictable in his paranoia, Caligula was not predictable at all. Here is where we need to be careful and honest. Because the stories about Caligula that have circulated for 2,000 years, the horse-made consul, the declaration of war on the sea, the incest with his sisters, the conversations with the moon, come from ancient sources written decades after his death by writers who had political reasons to portray him as maximally monstrous. Suetonius, our primary source for the most extreme stories, was writing under emperors who had every reason to want their predecessors portrayed as cautionary examples of what happened when the wrong person got power. This does not mean the stories are invented. It means they cannot all be taken at pure face value without considering the context in which they were written and preserved. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that Caligula's reign was genuinely characterized by unpredictable violence, by the execution of senators and other powerful Romans on charges that contemporaries found arbitrary, by financial recklessness that drained the imperial treasury with extraordinary speed, by behavior in public that violated Roman norms in ways that his contemporaries found alarming rather than merely eccentric, and by a general atmosphere of terror among the Roman elite that made his court a place where survival required constant vigilance about every word and expression. The specific stories may be embellished. The atmosphere of fear and unpredictability they describe appears to have been real. The people living through his reign were genuinely afraid in ways that went beyond normal political caution under an autocrat. One episode that illustrates the particular quality of Caligulian terror better than most of the more dramatic stories is relatively mundane by comparison. He reportedly invited a senator to dinner, treated him with extraordinary warmth and personal attention throughout the evening, and then laughed suddenly and would not explain why. The senator left the dinner not knowing whether he had just been honored or condemned. He spent the following days and weeks in agonizing uncertainty. Was the laughter fondness or contempt? Was he safe or doomed? Should he flee, or would fleeing itself trigger the death he was trying to avoid? This uncertainty, this inability to read whether imperial attention meant protection or destruction, was the defining psychological feature of life under Caligula for everyone who moved in proximity to power. In 39 AD, Caligula launched a military campaign to Germany and Britain. Or more precisely, he launched what was presented as a military campaign and was received by contemporaries and later historians as something considerably stranger. He moved a large army to the Rhine frontier and made preparations that looked like genuine invasion planning. Then the campaign produced results that ancient sources describe with barely concealed bewilderment. There were some operations against Germanic tribes that may have had genuine military substance. There was an episode where the army was apparently lined up on the beach of the English Channel facing Britain and then ordered to collect seashells as the spoils of their victory over the sea, Neptune having been defeated and the ocean's tribute claimed for Rome. Military historians have been trying to explain this episode for 2,000 years without reaching consensus. The most charitable interpretation is that there was a genuine military mutiny or refusal to cross the channel that Caligula converted into a face-saving theatrical exercise, the seashell collection being a humiliation of troops who had refused to follow orders rather than evidence of the emperor's own detachment from reality. Less charitable interpretations suggest the whole episode reflected a genuine disconnection from normal military and political logic. What is certain is that Caligula returned to Rome claiming a triumph for victories that his contemporaries regarded with skepticism, and that the Senate, with the careful expression management that had become necessary for survival, voted him the appropriate honors anyway. He celebrated what he described as extraordinary military achievements. Everyone else described the German campaign in much more muted terms when they described it at all. Life at Caligula's court was a masterclass in survival under conditions of absolute unpredictability. The people around him developed extraordinarily refined skills for reading his moods, anticipating his needs, positioning themselves neither too close nor too far, demonstrating enthusiasm that was neither so excessive as to seem threatening nor so restrained as to seem insufficiently devoted. Ancient sources describe courtiers practicing their expressions in mirrors before attending imperial functions. They describe men who had been friends for years avoiding each other in the palace because being seen together might suggest a conspiracy. They describe the elaborate mental calculations required just to walk into a room where the emperor was present. What to say, what not to say, where to look, how long to stay, how to leave without the exit itself becoming an offense. His sisters occupied a particularly strange and dangerous position in his court. He elevated them to extraordinary public honors unprecedented for Roman women. Their names were included in oaths. Their likenesses appeared on coins. They were given the privileges of Vestal virgins at public games. Ancient sources, including Suetonius, allege incestuous relationships between Caligula and at least some of his sisters. Whether these allegations are accurate, whether they were invented by hostile sources, or whether they represent some kind of reality that contemporaries perceived even if the details were embellished, is something historians genuinely cannot determine from this distance. What is clear is that his sisters moved from positions of extraordinary imperial favor to exile within a few years of his reign on accusations of conspiracy, the elevation and the destruction following the same pattern as everything else in his court. One of the most consequential episodes of Caligula's reign in terms of its impact beyond Rome was his conflict with the Jewish population of the empire. In Alexandria, Egypt, there was a large and established Jewish community that had long maintained certain rights and exemptions under Roman rule, including the right not to participate in imperial cult worship. When Caligula began his claims to literal divinity, these exemptions became politically untenable from his perspective. He ordered that a statue of himself be erected in the temple in Jerusalem, the holiest site in Judaism, where the presence of any divine image was a fundamental religious violation. The Jewish population of Judea and throughout the empire responded with what ancient sources describe as genuine mass despair and resistance. The order was resisted and delayed by the local Roman governor Petronius, who understood it would produce revolt. Petronius kept delaying the implementation of the statute order through various means, citing practical difficulties, writing to Caligula explaining the seriousness of the resistance, essentially stalling for time in hopes that something would change. Caligula sent back a letter ordering Petronius to kill himself for his disobedience. The letter arrived after Caligula was already dead and Petronius survived. But the episode illustrates something important about the practical problems of governing an empire when the emperor's commands were disconnected from political and logistical reality. Local administrators throughout the empire were increasingly forced to choose between implementing orders that would produce revolts they would have to manage themselves or delaying and risking the emperor's wrath. Caligula's reign was becoming genuinely ungovernable not just because of its violence, but because of its administrative chaos. By 40 AD, the conspiracy to kill Caligula was forming among men who had concluded that there was no other solution. The primary figures were Cassius Chaerea, a tribune of the Praetorian Guard who had personal reasons for resentment. Caligula reportedly mocked his voice and gave him deliberately humiliating watchwords like pleasure and beauty, and several other Praetorian officers and senators who had reached the same conclusion through varying combinations of personal fear and genuine political concern about where the reign was heading. The conspiracy was not ideologically Republican in the way Brutus's conspiracy against Caesar had been. These were not men trying to restore senatorial government. They were men trying to survive and trying to remove an emperor who had become a genuine threat to everyone around him, including his own guards. On January 24, 41 AD, Caligula was attending games and theatrical performances. He left the main theater through a covered passage during an intermission. Ancient sources disagree on exactly what he was going to do, whether to bathe, to eat, to meet with a group of young performers he had arranged to rehearse for him. Cassius Chaerea and other conspirators were waiting in the passage. Chaerea struck first, apparently asking Caligula for the day's watchword and then drawing his sword when it was given. What followed in that covered passage was brutal and very fast. Multiple attackers, many stab wounds, a man with absolute power dying in a covered walkway with nobody coming to help him because nobody in the palace knew immediately what was happening and nobody who suspected was going to be the first to act. He was 28 years old. He had reigned for 3 years, 10 months, and 8 days. Ancient sources record various last words and final behaviors. Some accounts have him crying out that he was still alive as the blows began. Others have him dying immediately from the first serious wound. What is consistent across sources is that the killing was quick once it began, and that the men who killed him had clearly been thinking about it for a long time. His wife Caesonia was killed immediately afterward, and his infant daughter was killed by being swung against a wall. Acts of extraordinary brutality that reveal how completely the conspirators had decided that the entire family needed to be eliminated to prevent future revenge rather than just the emperor himself. The Senate met almost immediately after the assassination and began discussing something that reveals how deeply the trauma of the previous 4 years had affected Roman political thinking. There were genuine discussions in the Senate about restoring the Republic, about ending the imperial system entirely and returning to genuinely shared senatorial governance. The discussions were serious enough that they lasted for at least a day or two of real deliberation. And then the Praetorian Guard, searching the palace in the immediate chaos after the killing, found Claudius, Caligula's uncle, a man in his 40s whom everyone had dismissed his entire life as a harmless fool because he walked with a limp, stuttered, and spent his time writing history books, hiding behind a curtain, reportedly terrified that the conspirators were coming for him next. The Praetorian Guard declared Claudius emperor before the Senate finished its Republican deliberations. They carried him to the Praetorian camp on their shoulders, declared their loyalty, and the discussion of restoring the Republic ended the way it always ended when the army had a preference, quietly and completely. The Senate confirmed what the Guard had already decided. Claudius, the man everyone had underestimated his entire life, the limping, stuttering historian who had survived Caligula's court precisely because he was too harmless to be worth killing, became emperor of Rome at the age of 49. He would prove to be one of the most capable administrators Rome ever produced. The man nobody feared was exactly what Rome needed after the man everyone feared. History has a particular sense of irony in its casting choices. So what actually happened to Caligula? Modern historians and psychologists looking at his reign through the lens of contemporary understanding have proposed various explanations. Some suggest the illness of 37 AD caused genuine neurological damage. Encephalitis or a similar condition affecting the brain can produce exactly the kind of personality change and deteriorating impulse control that ancient sources describe. Some suggest that the childhood trauma of watching his family destroyed, the years of enforced self-concealment, the performance of submission to a man he had every reason to hate, produced a psychological structure that collapsed catastrophically once the external constraints were removed and replaced with absolute power. Some suggest the ancient sources exaggerate, and that what they are describing is a cruel and paranoid autocrat rather than a genuinely deranged one. The most honest answer is that we cannot know with certainty from this distance. What we can observe is the pattern: a child who lost everything and survived by total self-suppression. A young man who emerged from that suppression into a position of absolute power with no preparation, no mentorship, no institutional constraints, and no one capable of telling him no without risking their lives. A brief illness that may have changed something neurologically or psychologically or both. And then 4 years of escalating behavior that ancient sources describe consistently across multiple writers with different agendas. The paranoia, the cruelty, the financial recklessness, the divine pretensions, the unpredictability that made everyone around him permanently anxious. Whatever the specific caused, the pattern itself is consistent and the outcome was real. The lesson that Roman historians drew from Caligula's reign was predictable and in some ways too simple, that the wrong person with absolute power produces catastrophe. But the more interesting lesson is about systems rather than individuals. Augustus built the Principate as a system where one person's character determined the fate of millions. He made it work through his own extraordinary qualities, his patience, his intelligence, his comprehensive understanding of what he was doing and why. But he built no meaningful constraints on his successors, no institutional checks, no way for the system to compensate when the person at the center was not Augustus. Tiberius was competent, but miserable and paranoid. Caligula was broken before he started. The system had no way to correct for either. It simply absorbed the consequences and continued. Caligula has been the subject of fascination for 2,000 years because his story touches something universal and genuinely disturbing. The beloved figure who becomes monstrous. The survivor who is destroyed by survival. The human being given the power of a god before acquiring the wisdom of a man. We tell his story as entertainment. The crazy emperor and his horse and his seashells and his divine pretensions. But underneath the entertainment is something that deserves more serious attention. What does it do to a person to watch their entire family destroyed while they are powerless to respond? What does it do to suppress every genuine feeling for years to survive? What does absolute power do to a mind that arrives at it already damaged in ways that nobody around that person can see or address? These are not just ancient questions. They are questions about power and trauma and the human capacity for cruelty under certain conditions that remain completely relevant to every century, including our own. Caligula is not interesting because he was uniquely evil. He is interesting because the conditions that produced him, childhood trauma, years of enforced powerlessness followed by sudden absolute power, no meaningful constraints, no one capable of honest counsel, surrounded by people whose survival depended on telling him what he wanted to hear. These conditions are not unique to first-century Rome. They recur. They have recurred throughout history. They will recur again. The story of Caligula is not a story about one broken emperor in ancient Rome. It is a story about what human beings do to each other when power has no limits and trauma has no treatment.